Jonny's Halloween Picks Slasher Edition.
Welcome to the first of my Halloween 2022 episodes. I hope you like my Halloween hoodie. Isn't it scary how orange it is? You should see it without the digital color correction. Anyways, if you're anything like me, you probably have somebody close to you who seems genuinely interested in watching scary movies with you over Halloween, but can't seem to build up the courage to actually do it. Or maybe that person is you. Unfortunately, this is a symptom of a common condition known as chicken shititis. The good news is, it's curable with some simple exposure therapy. So today, we are going to examine the evolution of slasher movies. I'll touch on what we like about them and why we like them. And hopefully, this will help these poor souls to finally sit down with you for a movie over this most festive of seasons. To me, Psycho's the first slasher movie, and if you don't agree, we can argue about it in the comments. After stealing money from her boss, Marion Crane takes off to meet her boyfriend so they can run away together. She sticks to the back roads to avoid the cops, and ends up at the Bates Motel, where she meets Norman Bates, who loves taxidermy, and his mother. When Psycho came out in 1960, censorship in America was just starting to loosen its grip on the throat of the film industry. But Psycho's depictions of violence and sexuality were shocking for audiences who still thought seeing an unmarried couple in the same bed was scandalous. Psycho is a slasher in its simplest form. It's a killer who stalks and murders people with a blade. Well, obviously there's more to it than that, but we're keeping this series spoiler-free. Being the first slasher, it kicked open two very important doors for future slasher films. Firstly, it raised the bar in terms of violence and sexuality in American movies. Secondly, Anthony Perkins' portrayal of Norman Bates created a global obsession with cinematic psychos. Psycho was so big, you don't even have to be a fan of horror movies to know about it. Everyone's heard the sharp screeching violins, and who doesn't know about the shower scene? The reason for this is simple. The tension in these movies wakes up the primitive animal in us. They tap into emotions and instincts we rarely encounter anymore in our relatively safe modern lives. And Psycho specifically reconnects us with these dormant instincts by showing us terrible things can happen anywhere to anyone. We're all vulnerable, even in the safety of a shower in a locked hotel room. Sally Hardesty, her brother, and their friends run out of gas on the way to her grandfather's house and get picked off one at a time by a chainsaw-wielding nutjob and his cannibalistic family. Coming out in 1974, Texas Chainsaw Massacre was groundbreaking for a few reasons. In production terms, it was a wildly successful DIY low-budget film that went on to inspire a slew of aspiring filmmakers to get up off their asses. It also gave us the final girl concept, and for those unacquainted, the final girl is the last girl standing at the end of a horror movie, or the one who figured out how to survive. Texas Chainsaw gave us Sally Hardesty, who's still making appearances nearly 50 years later, even if they're shitty appearances that don't make a lot of sense. And just like Psycho, it took inspiration from the real-life serial killer Ed Gein, in terms of his backwoods settings and Leatherface's iconic appearance, which would lead to countless future slashers featuring a masked killer. Also taken from the Psycho template, Texas Chainsaw Massacre's version of the shower scene comes in the form of Leatherface's first big on-screen appearance. Hitchcock's genius was creating a shocking and unexpected murder scene that showed you nothing despite being made up of 78 camera shots and 52 cuts. Texas Chainsaw's version took it a step further with a 10-second long jolting scene, punctuated by two perfectly designed thud sounds that'll stay in your ears for days after you've heard them. This movie was and is a massive influence despite having very little in the way of witty dialogue or themes. In fact, the lack of these things helped sell what really exhilarates fans of this movie. It happened in small-town USA. It featured one of the most disturbed families in movie history, and it looks so realistic, a lot of people believed it was a true story as the movie claims at its opening. And that believability is another vital element to the movie's long-term success. Not because we want these things to be real, but because way in the back of our minds, we know they aren't real because we're watching them on a screen. So the closer a movie gets to feeling real, the more exhilarated we become. At the start of winter break, a group of sorority sisters begin to receive anonymous and lascivious phone calls. In no time at all, girls start going missing and a serial killer suspected, and the killer ends up being much closer than anyone realizes. Like Texas Chainsaw, Black Christmas came out in 1974, and despite being the least popular film on my list, this movie started a load of slasher trends. The cast was mostly female, it was set in a sorority house, the killer operated primarily with a phone. This inspired an entire subset of sorority horror, and it goes without saying, you can find the odd killer utilizing a phone from time to time now too, but Black Christmas's biggest contribution was its format. Some attractive young folks and an elusive psycho with very little motive. It tightened up the concept and polished it. Factor in the juxtaposed Christmas holiday backdrop, and Black Christmas's influence on the next movie seems pretty obvious.
Yeah, I know. Halloween's on the Halloween slasher list. Get over it.
On Halloween night, 1963, an adorable little tyke named Michael Myers gets himself sent away for 15 years when he cuts his older sister to bits with a big shiny Ginsu. But on October 30th, 15 years later, he escapes and heads home to Haddonfield, Illinois to have a stab at picking up where he left off. Halloween cost about $300,000 which was still pennies by today's standards, but it went on to gross over $70 million. It was the most profitable independent film of all time until the stupid Blair Witch Project came out in 1999.
The ending made me angry.
Halloween kicked off a slew of slashers that lasted until around 1984. Basically, every trope you'd associate with the subgenre was solidified by Halloween. There's a perfect final girl in Jamie Lee Curtis's Laurie Strode. There's a high body count made up of mostly innocent bystanders. And each of the kills were interesting and unique and sometimes ridiculous. There's an iconic masked killer who's intriguing, not because we understand him, but because we don't. And the killer had his own distinctive, iconic theme music. Just like Black Christmas, the holiday atmosphere is used as a lighthearted backdrop to contrast the dark material.
When you combine all these things in a movie that was shot and produced to look and sound like a regular movie, it's easy to understand a lot of Halloween's success comes from its universal relevance.
These are normal people in a normal setting. Most people can relate to Halloween as a holiday, and a lot of us had babysitters when we were young. Even our masked killer, Michael Myers, is believable in the sense there are real, living, breathing people just like him all around us every day, sitting across from us on the subway or working beside us in the next cubicle. A group of counselors are picked off one by one at Camp Crystal Lake.
That's it.
The original Friday the 13th came out in 1980. It was obviously spurred on by Halloween, but it didn't try to imitate its brilliant simplicity. Instead, it took the bare bones of that simplicity and cranked it up to 10. It did away completely with character backstory, so you didn't give a shit when somebody was cut to shreds. But you did get backstory on the killer, whose name I won't mention here, just in case anyone's still unacquainted.
What? They probably exist somewhere.
Friday the 13th also made the genius decision to shift things into the seclusion of a camping site in the woods, a place you'd have fond childhood memories of, a place you'd normally feel safe. And finally, it amplified things Halloween touched on by establishing sex is a bad thing in slasher movies. Friday taught us if you went to the trouble of peeling off your super tight 1980s jeans, you just weren't gonna make it to the end of the movie. Aside from the secluded setting, this initial installment advanced slashers for two reasons. Firstly was its ending, which felt more like a reveal scene in a murder mystery, and that was unheard of in 1980s slasher flicks. And second, it gave us permission to admire horror movie kills for their creativity without feeling guilty about it. When you don't know the characters, they're just objects on a big screen. For a lot of horror fans, this is fun and cathartic. A group of counselors are picked off one by one at Camp Crystal Lake.
And that's it. Again. However,
Part 2 in the series came out a year after the first, and while both movies have identical settings and tones and body counts and final girls, one fundamental difference makes Part 2 a progression from Part 1. The original established Friday the 13th as a fixture in slasher horror, but it was the second movie that established Jason Voorhees as a horror powerhouse and eventual supernatural entity. Part 2 did all the same things Part 1 did, and it did them well. But this time around, we knew the killer's backstory, and we were rooting for him.
Not because everyone in the audience was a sociopath, but because we had no attachment to this new season's camp counselors. And as per the first movie, that was done by design.
These movies can be controversial because some people think these kills desensitize viewers to the suffering of other people. But that supposition ignores the fact the victims in these movies are not portrayed as people. They're caricatures. The jock, the scholar, the nerd, the virgin, and the easy girl.
Okay, you're right. The easy girls. It was the 80s.
When you don't acknowledge this vital difference, these movies will always seem repulsive and repugnant. But when you do, you can see them as the exhilarating roller coaster ride they're supposed to be. A young girl and her gang of big-haired friends realize they'll have to stay awake if they want to avoid getting slaughtered by a clawed maniac who's killing them in real life by slashing them to bits in their dreams. When A Nightmare on Elm Street came out in 1984, Wes Craven was no stranger to violence or gore, having already directed a couple of scary movies by that point. And although he wanted his killer masked, he also wanted him verbally assaulting his victims. So the mask became horrible scarring from fire, and our iconic killer was named Freddy Krueger after somebody that bullied Wes Craven as a kid. Nightmare on Elm Street bears all the bloody markings of a slasher. We have one of the most prominent final girls in Heather Langenkamp's Nancy, we have another massive iconic killer in Freddy, and there's a high body count. But Nightmare's different because the kills happen in the victim's dreams. That gave Wes Craven and any slasher director following license to do whatever the hell they wanted. In true Friday the 13th fashion, the supporting characters in Elm Street are also one-dimensional and pretty cringy in their simplicity. But Elm Street fleshes out its lead character and final girl, Nancy, which gives us the best of both worlds. We're able to laugh when Freddy systematically dispenses of the supporting characters, and we're able to root for Nancy as she fights for her own survival. This movie resonates with fans because it eradicates the line between what's real and what's imagined, and that touches on something very dark in real life. Depending on where you're standing in relation to it, that line, in reality, can dictate whether you're a sane person or not. A woman buys her son Andy a very popular doll for his birthday, and Andy calls it Chucky, and Chucky ends up being possessed by the spirit of a dead serial killer. Like Friday the 13th and Elm Street, Child's Play ramps up the supernatural elements, but it still gives us what we expect in terms of body count and an iconic killer at its helm. The obvious difference being this iconic killer's stuck in the tiny body of a possessed doll. By the time Child's Play was released in 1988, slasher fans were starting to get bored of the Michael and Freddy and Jason routines. Not that they weren't fun anymore, but too much of anything will eventually wear you down. Child's Play revitalized things by ramping up the parody factor and amplifying everything new about Freddy Krueger. Chucky looked adorable, but he was sarcastic and vicious, and how could you not laugh at the physical restrictions the doll's form imposed on an otherwise cunning and prolific killer? And at the same time, what a perfect disguise. In hindsight, it's surprising nobody thought of it earlier. Nobody would ever believe a child when they blamed their doll for things going awry. And while it was camp and silly, there was a balance to it. It also had a legit scary plotline. Child's Play has a huge following for obvious reasons. Chucky's kills are inventive and he's funny and sinister at the same time. His physical appearance combined with the contradictions of his hateful, homicidal tendencies make him a surprisingly complex killer and a very entertaining one to watch. A skeptical grad student named Helen investigates a local superstition about a one-armed killer named Candyman. When a mysterious gentleman matching Candyman's description starts popping up around every corner, Helen's forced to consider the legend might not be a legend at all.
As we've established, coming out of the 90s, slasher fans expected high kill counts and creativity and a tough final girl and an entertaining iconic killer with intelligence and personality to boot.
And 1992's Candyman did not disappoint. It had the kills. They were definitely creative. There was a version of a final girl in Virginia Madsen's Helen. Our killer, the titular Candyman, was dignified and articulate and seductive and smooth and alluring. But Tony Todd's legendary performance in this film is only part of Candyman's contribution to the evolution of slasher movies. Other movies had used urban legends prior to 1996, but Candyman managed to use its legend to integrate themes of misogyny and racial injustice practices into the slasher formula without ever smacking you over the head with any of it. And it manages to do all this with romantic undertones. This movie has a great story. It's intelligent and meaningful, and it works because it conveys its message without making you feel spoken down to. Candyman proved you can demonstrate your point without demonizing the people watching the movie. And doing this in such a brutal and bloody manner, it created yet another progression in slasher films. A year after Sidney Prescott's mother's killed, other murders start happening, and Sidney thinks they all might have been done by the same killer. The only problem is, everyone she knows is a suspect. When it came out in 1996, Scream hit theaters like a bomb. Slasher fans were bored. Movies like Silence of the Lambs were making typical slasher flicks suddenly feel stupid. But for the second time in his illustrious horror career, Wes Craven saved the day by reinvigorating the concept from the ground up. And he did it with a very simple question.
Hello.
Do you like scary movies?
Hairy boobies.
Scream was still full of good-looking 30-year-old teenagers and all the tropes we've come to expect. But instead of plugging each of them into their predetermined places in the plot, Craven made the movie a funny, frightening examination of the absurdity of the conventions themselves. So for the first time ever, we fans didn't have to warn the characters to look behind them when they were most vulnerable, because they were reminding us they already knew what we were expecting from them. There was still a final girl, only Sidney Prescott was tough and prepared and fighting back every step of the way. There was a mass killer, but they were goofy and their identity was a total mystery right up until the final minutes. By turning the tropes upside down, Scream dissolved the barrier between the fans and the film, which made it a template for the dozens of self-aware meta-horror stories that followed it.
And there you have it, folks, a brief history of slasher movies. And hopefully now when you watch the modern ones, you'll be able to recognize where all the elements come from. Then you can be one of those people at parties that act like they know everything. And if you or a loved one actually does suffer from chicken shititis, I hope you found this video useful. And if you're considering branching out even further into horror, my next video is going to be on zombies. Until next time, folks. It's me, Johnny, from that thing you just watched. If you enjoyed it, go down there and smash me in the face to subscribe. And if you want to watch another thing, there's one right there. Do it!